The moment the floorboard gave way beneath her foot, revealing a metal box that hadn't seen daylight in 70 years, Margaret knew their son had been catastrophically wrong about everything. What lay hidden beneath their worthless cabin would not only vindicate decades of sacrifice, but expose a family secret that reached back through 3 generations of deliberate deception. Before we dive into the story, make sure to smash subscribe, because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. Harold and Margaret Whitman had spent their entire lives in the shadow of other people's success. Harold, 73, had worked 42 years at the paper mill in Riverside, Minnesota. His hands gradually growing gnarled from decades of operating heavy machinery. Margaret, 71, had raised their 3 children while working nights at the hospital cafeteria, serving lukewarm meals to exhausted doctors who never learned her name. Their eldest son, Richard, had absorbed their work ethic but twisted it into something they barely recognized. By 45, he'd become senior partner at a Minneapolis law firm, his success measured in billable hours and the square footage of his corner office. He drove a Mercedes that cost more than Harold had earned in his best year, lived in a house with more bathrooms than occupants, and spoke to his parents with the patient condescension typically reserved for slow children. Their daughter, Sarah, had married an investment banker and relocated to Connecticut, where she hosted charity galas for causes she couldn't quite articulate and sent expensive gifts instead of visiting. Their youngest, Michael, had pursued art until Richard convinced him that creativity without profit was mere self-indulgence. Now he designed logos for corporations, his dreams compressed into vector graphics and brand guidelines. The cabin on Deer Lake had been in Margaret's family for 3 generations, built by her grandfather, Ezra Campbell, in 1951 with his own hands. 20 miles from the nearest town, accessible only by a rutted dirt road that turned to mud in spring and became nearly impassable in winter, it represented everything Richard found embarrassing about his origins. "It's not even winterized properly," he'd complained during his increasingly rare visits. "The plumbing's from the Stone Age, there's no cell service, and don't get me started on that death trap you call a dock." Harold would listen to these critiques in silence, his jaw tightening as his son cataloged the cabin's deficiencies. Margaret would busy herself in the kitchen, preparing meals on the ancient wood-burning stove that Richard insisted was a fire hazard waiting to happen. The breaking point came on a humid Thursday in July. Richard had driven up unannounced, his Tesla struggling with the uneven road, to deliver what he called a reality check wrapped in an opportunity. "You're not getting any younger," he began, settling into the worn plaid armchair that had been Harold's father's. "Mom, your arthritis is getting worse. Dad, you can barely manage the dock repairs anymore. It's time to think practically." Margaret set down her knitting, recognizing the tone Richard used when he'd already decided everyone else's future. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Sunset Shores Retirement Community. Richard produced a glossy brochure with the practiced flourish of someone who'd rehearsed this moment. "It's got everything: medical staff on site, organized activities, a dining hall so Mom doesn't have to cook anymore. They've got an opening, but we need to move fast." Harold's weathered hands gripped the arms of his chair. "We're not invalids, son. We manage just fine." "Do you?" Richard's voice carried that particular blend of exasperation and condescension he'd perfected in boardrooms. "When's the last time you climbed on that roof to check for leaks? How many times has Mom fallen on that uneven floor in the kitchen? And this place," he gestured dismissively at the cabin's log walls, "it's literally falling apart." "This place," Margaret said quietly, "is our home." Richard's laugh was sharp, humorless. "It's a shack, Mom. A worthless, deteriorating shack that's probably worth less than the land it's sitting on. You're holding on to it out of misguided nostalgia while it drains your savings in maintenance and repairs." The word "worthless" hung in the air like a physical presence. Margaret felt it settle into her chest, a cold weight that made breathing difficult. She'd watched her grandfather build these walls, helped her grandmother plant the garden that still bloomed every summer, raised her children on this same warped wooden floor that Richard found so offensive. "The smart move," Richard continued, oblivious to or unconcerned by the pain he was causing, is to sell this place for whatever you can get, probably not much given its condition, and use that money towards Sunset Shores. I can cover the rest. Cover the rest, Harold repeated slowly. Like we're charity cases. Like you're my parents and I want you to be safe and comfortable, Richard countered. Honestly, I don't understand the attachment to this dump. It's isolated, it's primitive, and frankly, it's embarrassing when colleagues ask about family properties, and I have to explain that my parents choose to live like pioneers. Margaret stood abruptly, her arthritis forgotten in the surge of indignation. If you're so embarrassed by us, perhaps you should leave. Richard's expression shifted to wounded surprise, the practiced look of someone unaccustomed to resistance. Mom, I'm trying to help. The market for these old cabins is terrible. You'd be lucky to get $30,000 for this place. And that's if you can find a buyer willing to deal with the repairs needed. It's worthless in its current state, and you're too proud to admit it. Get out. Harold's voice was quiet, but it carried the authority of a man who'd never had to repeat himself in his own home. You've said your piece. Now get out. Richard gathered his things with theatrical huffs of frustration, pausing at the door for one final volley. When you're stuck here next winter with frozen pipes and no way to get help, remember that I offered you a solution. This stubborn attachment to a worthless cabin is going to be the death of you both. The door slammed with enough force to rattle the pictures on the wall. Through the window, they watched their son navigate his expensive car around the potholes with visible irritation, disappearing into the forest that had sheltered their family for generations. Margaret sank back into her chair, tears flowing silently down her weathered cheeks. Harold moved to comfort her, his own eyes suspiciously bright. Worthless, she whispered. He called it worthless. He's wrong, Harold said firmly, though the words rang hollow against the echo of their son's contempt. He's forgotten what really matters. They sat in silence as afternoon shadows lengthened across the cabin floor, the familiar sounds of the lake loons calling, waves lapping against the shore. Wine through the pines provided a counterpoint to the harsh words that still reverberated in the space. That night, neither slept well. Margaret lay awake cataloging every repair needed, every surface that showed its age, every way the cabin fell short of modern standards. Harold stared at the ceiling, wrestling with the knowledge that success had transformed their son into someone who measured worth solely in monetary terms. The next morning arrived gray and drizzly, matching their mood. Harold made coffee on the propane stove, while Margaret attempted to sweep the kitchen floor, a task made difficult by the uneven boards that had warped over decades of Minnesota seasons. Maybe we should consider it, she said quietly, pausing in a spot where the floor dipped noticeably. The retirement home. Harold set down his coffee cup with more force than necessary. Margaret Ann Whitman, in 52 years of marriage, I've never heard you give up on anything. I'm not giving up, she protested. I'm being realistic. Look at this place through Richard's eyes. The roof needs work. The foundation has that crack on the north side. The dock's half rotted, and we can't keep up with it all anymore. Since when do we see through Richard's eyes? Harold demanded. This is the cabin where we spent our honeymoon, where our children learned to swim, where your father taught me to fish. You're going to let our son's opinion erase all that? Margaret's broom caught on a particularly warped board near the corner, one that had been loose for years despite Harold's attempts to nail it down. She pushed harder, frustration lending strength to the movement. The board suddenly gave way entirely, tilting up to reveal a dark space beneath. Harold, she called, bending to examine the gap. This board's completely loose. He joined her, groaning slightly as his knees protested the journey to floor level. Together, they pried up the board, expecting to find the usual accumulation of decades-old dust and possibly mouse droppings. Instead, Margaret's fingers encountered something solid and unexpectedly cold. Metal. What in the world? Harold retrieved a flashlight, illuminating a rectangular metal box nestled between the floor joists. It was perhaps 18 inches long, a foot wide, and covered in a thick layer of dust that suggested it had been undisturbed for decades. With effort, they extracted the box, Harold's hands trembling slightly as he set it on the kitchen table. It was heavier than its size suggested, made of thick steel with a simple padlock that had long since rusted. Should we call someone? Margaret asked, though she was already reaching for the toolbox. This could be anything. After yesterday? Harold snorted. I'm not calling Richard to tell him we found an old box. He'd probably calculate its scrap metal value and deducted from our retirement home fees. Using a combination of oil, persistence, and eventually a hacksaw, they removed the ancient lock. The lid opened with a groan of protest, revealing contents wrapped in oilcloth that had remarkably preserved whatever lay within. Margaret peeled back the first layer with careful fingers, revealing bundled documents tied with string that disintegrated at her touch. Beneath those, more papers, and beneath those. My God, Harold breathed. Stock certificates, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Their ornate borders and official seals proclaiming ownership in companies Margaret recognized even through the old-fashioned printing. Standard Oil, U.S. Steel, General Electric, American Telephone, and Telegraph. But it was the bottom layer that made Margaret's hands shake. Bearer bonds, the kind that hadn't been issued in decades, each one promising payment to whoever held the physical document. The numbers printed on them seemed impossible. $10,000, $25,000, even several marked $100,000. This can't be real, Margaret whispered. These have to be worthless old papers someone stored and forgot about. Harold was already reaching for his reading glasses, examining the certificates with the methodical attention he'd once applied to mill equipment specifications. The dates. Margaret, these are from the 1,940 seconds. And early 1,950 seconds. If these companies still exist, if these are legitimate. But why? Margaret pulled out more documents, finding beneath them a leather journal, its pages yellow but intact. Why would someone hide this here? The journal's first page provided the answer in her grandfather's careful script. For Margaret, when the time is right, may you forgive a cautious man's fears and a father's protective instincts. EC 1951. Margaret sank into a chair, the journal clutched to her chest. Grandpa Ezra, he left this for me. They spent the rest of the morning reading, the rain pattering against the windows as Ezra Campbell's story unfolded through careful entries. He'd been more than the simple carpenter everyone remembered. During the 1,920 seconds, he'd worked in Chicago, invested his earnings wisely, and accumulated a small fortune through patient investment and fortunate timing. The 1,929 crash had destroyed many, but Ezra had been cautious, converting much of his wealth to bearer bonds and stable stocks before the collapse. He'd returned to Minnesota, built the cabin, and raised his family in deliberate simplicity, haunted by how wealth had corrupted friends and destroyed families during the boom years. I've seen what money does to people, one entry read. Seen families torn apart by greed, children who learn to value inheritance over love. Better my Margaret grows up knowing hard work and simple pleasures. The wealth is here if truly needed, but I pray she never is desperate enough to look for it. Margaret wiped tears from her eyes. Her grandfather had died when she was 25, just married to Harold. Just starting their life together. He'd left the cabin to her with instructions to keep it in the family, no matter what anyone says about its worth. He knew, she said softly. Somehow he knew there might come a time when someone would call it worthless, when I might be tempted to give it up. Harold was making lists, his practical nature asserting itself. We need to verify these are still valid. Some of these companies have merged, changed names, the bearer bonds. I don't even know if banks still honor those. Should we call Richard? Margaret asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. The son who called this place worthless? Harold shook his head. I think we need to understand what we have first. Tomorrow, we'll drive to Minneapolis, find someone who specializes in old securities. Quietly, they spent the rest of the day carefully documenting each certificate, each bond, cross-referencing with Ezra's journal entries. The old man had been meticulous, recording purchase dates, amounts, and his reasoning for each investment. Look at this. Harold pointed to an entry from 1,947. He bought IBM stock when it was still making tabulating machines. Do you have any idea what that's worth now? Margaret was staring at a bearer bond for $100,000, trying to wrap her mind around the number. This single piece of paper, Harold, this is more than you earned in 5 years at the mill. If it's still valid, he cautioned, though his excitement was evident. These are 70 years old. Companies go bankrupt. Bonds expire. But if even some of them are good. Margaret trailed off, afraid to voice the possibility. That night, they barely slept again, but for entirely different reasons. The metal box sat on their dresser like a presence, its contents representing either worthless paper or a complete transformation of their circumstances. Margaret found herself thinking about Richard's words. Worthless cabin. Embarrassing. Primitive. She looked around their bedroom with new eyes, seeing not decay but decades of careful maintenance. Not primitive conditions, but the conscious choice of simplicity. Not worthlessness, but a treasure, hidden in plain sight for 70 years. Harold woke at 3 a.m. to find her sitting at the window, watching moonlight play across the lake's surface. Can't sleep either? He asked, joining her. I keep thinking about Grandpa Ezra, she said. He could have lived anywhere, done anything with this money. Instead, he chose this, built this cabin with his own hands, raised my mother here. Kept his secret even from his own daughter. He was protecting them, Harold said. Look what wealth did to Richard, and he earned his. Imagine if he'd grown up knowing there was a fortune hidden under his feet. Would he have worked hard? Would he have achieved anything on his own? Margaret nodded slowly. Or would he have become even more insufferable, waiting for an inheritance he felt entitled to? They watched the sun rise over Deer Lake, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that no amount of money could improve upon. Whatever the day brought, whatever the certificates proved to be worth, Margaret realized the cabin had already given them its greatest gift, the understanding that worth couldn't be measured in market value alone. After a breakfast of nervous energy and black coffee, they prepared for the drive to Minneapolis. Harold checked the truck's fluids with his usual thoroughness, while Margaret wrapped the most important-looking documents in plastic, placing them carefully in her grandmother's leather satchel. Should we take everything? Harold asked. Margaret shook her head. Just samples. If these prove valuable, we don't want to risk losing everything in one trip. The drive to Minneapolis took 3 hours, made longer by their anxious speculation and Harold's unusually cautious driving. They'd researched financial antiquities dealers online, finding a firm called Heritage Securities that specialized in old stocks and bonds. The office occupied the 3rd floor of a restored Victorian building in the warehouse district. Its modern interior, a stark contrast to the aged documents in Margaret's satchel. The receptionist, a young woman with perfectly styled hair, looked mildly surprised when they explained they had no appointment but needed consultation about old securities. I'll see if Mr. Pemberton has any availability, she said, though her tone suggested she doubted he would. 20 minutes later, they were ushered into an office lined with framed historical stock certificates. James Pemberton, a man in his 60s with the careful grooming of someone who dealt with serious money, rose to greet them. I understand you found some old family securities, he said, gesturing to chairs across from his mahogany desk. It's more common than you might think. Unfortunately, most prove to be worthless, companies long defunct or certificates improperly transferred. But let's have a look. Margaret produced the first bundle with trembling hands. Pemberton's professional demeanor slipped slightly as he examined them, reaching for a jeweler's loupe and a thick reference book. These are unusually well preserved, he murmured, checking watermarks and serial numbers. May I ask where they were stored? In a metal box under the floorboards of our cabin, Harold said. They belonged to my wife's grandfather. Pemberton's examination became more intense. He cross-referenced numbers in multiple databases, made several phone calls speaking in rapid financial terminology, and finally looked up with an expression Margaret couldn't quite read. Mrs. Whitman, Mr. Whitman, I need to be very clear about something. These certificates appear to be authentic. More importantly, they're for companies that have not only survived, but thrived. This IBM stock alone, accounting for splits and decades of growth. He turned his computer monitor to show them a calculation that made Harold grip the desk edge for support. That can't be right, Margaret whispered. That number is conservative, Pemberton finished. This is based solely on the IBM certificates. You mentioned having more? Margaret nodded mutely, unable to form words. The bearer bonds are another matter, Pemberton continued. These are increasingly rare. The government stopped allowing their issuance because they were essentially untraceable wealth. But those issued before 1982 remain valid if the issuing entity still exists. These appear to be from solid institutions that have survived multiple mergers. I'll need to verify, but preliminarily. He showed them another figure. Harold made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob. 50 million might be low, Pemberton said quietly. Depending on what else you have in that cabin? The office seemed to spin slightly. Margaret reached for Harold's hand, needing the anchor of his familiar touch in this suddenly unfamiliar world. What do we do? She asked. Pemberton's manner became even more serious. First, you tell no one about this until we've secured and verified everything. Wealth of this magnitude attracts attention, not all of it benign. Second, we need to retrieve the remaining documents securely. I can arrange for bonded couriers and security. Third, you'll need legal counsel specializing in estate planning and tax implications. Taxes, Harold said faintly. I hadn't even thought. The IRS will want their share, Pemberton confirmed. But there are legitimate ways to minimize the impact. The important thing is to proceed carefully and methodically. They spent another 2 hours in Pemberton's office, signing preliminary agreements, authorizing initial verifications, and struggling to absorb the magnitude of their discovery. Pemberton arranged for them to return the next day with security to retrieve the remaining documents. The drive home was surreal. They passed billboards and strip malls, ordinary sights that seemed to belong to a different lifetime. The lifetime where they were retired mill workers scraping by on Social Security and savings. We should call the children, Harold said eventually. And tell them what? Margaret asked. That their worthless cabin just made their parents multimillionaires? That Grandpa Ezra's paranoia about wealth was so strong he hid a fortune that could have made their lives easier? Harold was quiet for several miles. Maybe Ezra was right. Would we be the same people if we'd known this was there all along? Would our children? Margaret thought about Richard's Mercedes, his corner office, his disdain for their simple life. Richard already believes money is the only measure of worth. This would just confirm it for him. But Sarah and Michael need to know eventually, Margaret agreed. But not yet. Not until we understand what this means, what we want to do with it. They arrived back at the cabin as afternoon sun slanted through the trees. It looked exactly as they'd left it, worn and weathered and beloved. But now, Margaret saw it differently. Not just as a refuge or a memory, but as a 70-year secret keeper, a test of values that they'd passed without knowing they were being tested. That evening, as they sat on the dock watching the sun set over Deer Lake, the reality began to settle in. They were wealthy, wealthier than Richard with all his success, wealthier than they could have imagined in their most optimistic dreams. What do we do with it? Harold asked. $50 million. We could buy 100 cabins. But we only need one, Margaret said softly. This one, Harold smiled, the first genuine smile since Richard's visit. You're right, but we could fix the roof properly, maybe even update the plumbing. Margaret laughed, surprising herself. Wild dreams, Harold Whitman. Next, you'll be suggesting we fix that death trap of a dock. They talked late into the night. Plans taking shape, not for massive lifestyle changes or ostentatious displays of wealth, but for security, for helping their children and grandchildren without destroying their work ethic, for supporting the causes they'd always wished they could afford to help. We need to be smart about telling Richard, Margaret said. He'll have opinions about how we should invest, what we should do. Richard can have all the opinions he wants, Harold said firmly. But this is our decision. Ezra left this to you, not to our entitled son who thinks success means forgetting where you came from. What happens next in this remarkable discovery will challenge everything this family believes about wealth, worth, and the true value of inheritance. If you're enjoying this story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. The next morning arrived with unusual clarity, the kind of crisp Minnesota day that made the lake sparkle like scattered diamonds. Margaret woke early, her mind still processing the previous day's revelations. She found Harold already up, sitting at the kitchen table with Ezra's journal, reading entries they'd skipped in their initial excitement. "Listen to this," he said without preamble. "Money is like water, necessary for life, but dangerous in flood. I've seen men drown in their own success, seen families shattered by the weight of gold. Better my descendants know the value of work than the corruption of easy wealth." Margaret poured coffee, her movements automatic despite her churning thoughts. "He was right, wasn't he? Look at Richard. We gave him everything we could, and he grew up to despise us for not having more. But we also have Sarah and Michael," Harold reminded her. "They're not perfect, but they're not Richard either." A knock at the door interrupted their discussion. Margaret glanced at the clock. 7:30 a.m., too early for casual visitors. Harold answered to find Frank Morrison, their nearest neighbor from 2 miles down the shore, standing on the porch with a concerned expression. "Morning, Harold." "Margaret," Frank said. "Sorry to bother you so early, but I saw a couple of official-looking vehicles drive past my place toward your road around 6 a.m. Thought you should know, in case there's trouble." Harold and Margaret exchanged glances. Pemberton had said he'd send security today, but not this early, and he would have called first. "Thanks, Frank," Harold said carefully. "Probably just lost tourists." Frank looked skeptical but didn't press. After he left, Harold immediately called Pemberton's emergency number. "We didn't send anyone," Pemberton said, suddenly alert. "Don't answer the door for anyone. I'm dispatching our security team now. They'll be there within 2 hours." The next 90 minutes passed with agonizing slowness. They moved the metal box to a new hiding spot, wrapped the remaining securities in waterproof bags, and waited. Harold loaded his father's old shotgun, more for comfort than any real belief it would be necessary. When vehicles finally appeared on their dirt road, Margaret watched from the window with binoculars. 2 black SUVs and a sedan, moving slowly over the rutted surface. "That's them," Harold said, recognizing the license plate Pemberton had provided. The security team was professional, efficient, and slightly intimidating. Led by a former state police detective named Carl Brennan, they swept the property, checked for surveillance devices, and established a perimeter that transformed the humble cabin into something from a thriller movie. "Mr. Pemberton filled me in on the basics," Brennan explained. "You've potentially got tens of millions in bearer instruments here. That's like having gold bars in your basement. We need to get these secured immediately." They worked quickly, documenting each certificate, photographing serial numbers, and packing everything in specialized cases. Margaret felt a pang watching Ezra's legacy disappear into armored boxes, even knowing it was necessary. "What about the early visitors Frank saw?" Harold asked. Brennan frowned. "We'll investigate. Could be coincidence, but in my experience, there's no such thing when this much money is involved. Who else knows about your discovery?" "No one," Margaret said. "Just Mr. Pemberton, and now you." "Keep it that way," Brennan advised. "At least until everything's properly secured and verified." After the security team left with the securities, the cabin felt different, emptier, despite nothing visible having changed. Margaret stood in the kitchen, staring at the corner where the loose floorboard had been now firmly nailed down by Harold. "It doesn't feel real," she said. "Yesterday we were worried about paying for roof repairs. Today we're millionaires with bodyguards." Harold pulled her close. "We're the same people we were yesterday. Same cabin, same lake, same life. The only thing that's changed is a number in a bank account we haven't even set up yet." They spent the afternoon trying to maintain normalcy, Harold working on dock repairs while Margaret tended her vegetable garden. But their minds kept drifting to the implications of their discovery. That evening, Pemberton called with updates. "Initial verifications are extremely promising. The IBM stock alone is worth approximately $12 million. The General Electric holdings, another $8 million. The bearer bonds are more complex. We need to trace the issuing banks through various mergers, but conservative estimates put their value between 20 and 30 million. Margaret sank into a chair. The numbers were too large to process, like trying to understand astronomical distances. "There's more," Pemberton continued. "Some of these holdings generated dividends that were never claimed. By law, they've been accumulating in state unclaimed property funds. We're looking at potentially millions more in back dividends. How is that possible? Harold asked. Bearer instruments don't require registration. If no one claims the dividends, they simply accumulate until someone with proper documentation appears. Your grandfather was either incredibly shrewd or incredibly lucky. Probably both. After ending the call, they sat in silence, watching darkness fall over the lake. The loons were calling, their haunting cries a reminder that some things remained unchanged by human fortune. We need to make decisions, Harold finally said. About the children, about what this means for us. Richard will be furious, Margaret predicted. He'll see this as proof we were holding out on him, that we could have helped more with his education, his business ventures. Richard had every advantage we could provide, Harold said firmly. He chose to look down on us anyway. This doesn't change that. They decided to wait before telling any of the children, at least until all the securities were verified and initial tax planning was complete. But the weight of the secret pressed on them, made heavier by its magnitude. 3 days later, their careful plans were disrupted by an unexpected call. Sarah, their daughter in Connecticut, rarely phoned outside of holidays and birthdays. Her voice was strained, barely controlled. Mom, Dad, I need to ask you something, and please don't be offended. Did you recently come into money? Any kind of windfall or inheritance? Margaret's blood chilled. Why would you ask that, honey? Because Richard called yesterday. He's been going on about how you two are hiding assets, that someone told him you were seen at some high-end financial firm in Minneapolis. He's convinced you've been poor-mouthing while sitting on a fortune. Harold took the phone. Sarah, where did Richard get this idea? I don't know, but he's worked up about it. He kept saying something about making sure you don't do anything foolish with money that should be preserved for the family. Dad, what's going on? They exchanged glances, silently debating. Sarah had never shown Richard's entitlement, but she'd also grown comfortable in her wealthy lifestyle, perhaps too comfortable. We'll call you back, Harold said. There are some things we need to discuss first. After hanging up, the implications hit them. Someone had seen them at Pemberton's office. Someone had recognized them, connected them to Richard, and stirred up trouble. So much for secrecy, Margaret said bitterly. We should have known. Richard probably has connections everywhere in Minneapolis financial circles. Harold was already reaching for his jacket. We need to see Pemberton. If Richard knows something, we need to get ahead of this. The drive to Minneapolis felt different this time, charged with urgency rather than wonder. Pemberton met them despite the late hour, his expression grave. If your son is already inquiring, we need to accelerate our timeline, he said. The verifications are nearly complete anyway. We should establish the family trust immediately. Get everything properly structured before anyone can challenge your capacity or decision-making. Challenge our capacity? Margaret's voice sharpened. We're not senile. Of course not, Pemberton soothed. But with this much money at stake, adult children have been known to raise questions, especially if they feel they're being excluded from decisions about family wealth. The next hours blurred together in a haze of legal documents, trust structures, and tax strategies. They established irrevocable trusts that would protect the assets while providing for their children and grandchildren in measured ways that wouldn't destroy their ambition or work ethic. The key, their new estate attorney explained, is balancing generosity with protection. You want to help your family without enabling dependency or entitlement. It was nearly midnight when they finally returned to the cabin. Exhausted but relieved to have basic protections in place. The sight of their simple home, unchanged by the day's frantic activity, provided profound comfort. But their peace was short-lived. The next morning, Richard's Tesla appeared on their dirt road, moving aggressively despite the ruts. He emerged already talking, his voice carrying across the yard. I knew it, he said without preamble. Pemberton Financial specializes in historical securities. The only reason you'd be there is if you found something valuable. What is it? Old mining claims? Railroad bonds? How much are we talking about? Harold stepped onto the porch, blocking the doorway. Good morning to you too, son. Don't play games, Richard snapped. I have a right to know about family assets. If you've discovered something that belonged to Mom's family, it affects all of us. Does it? Margaret appeared beside Harold, her voice calm but eyes flashing. Like this worthless cabin affects you? Richard had the grace to flush slightly. That was a practical assessment of the property value, not a judgment on your attachment to it. This is different. We're talking about real money. Everything's about real money with you, Harold observed. Never about real value. Spare me the philosophy lesson, Richard said. How much did you find? And why didn't you call me immediately? I could have handled this properly, made sure you weren't taken advantage of. Margaret laughed, surprising all of them. Taken advantage of? Richard, you tried to convince us to sell our home for pennies and lock ourselves in a retirement facility. Who exactly is taking advantage here? I was trying to help, Richard protested. You're not equipped to handle significant financial decisions. No offense, but Dad worked in a mill. You have no experience with real wealth management. No, Harold agreed. We only managed to raise 3 children, pay for their education, maintain this property for 50 years, and survive every economic downturn without declaring bankruptcy. Clearly, we're financial incompetents. Richard's frustration was visible. Just tell me what you found. I can help structure everything properly, minimize taxes, set up appropriate vehicles for wealth preservation. Everything's already handled, Margaret said quietly, by professionals who don't call our home worthless. You set up trusts without consulting me? Richard's voice rose. I'm an attorney. I should have been involved in any legal structuring of family assets. You're our son, Harold corrected. Not our attorney? And based on your recent behavior, we have serious concerns about your judgment regarding family matters. Richard's face cycled through several shades of red. My judgment? I'm the only one in this family who's achieved real success. I'm trying to protect you from making costly mistakes with whatever windfall you've stumbled into. Stumbled into, Margaret repeated, like we're children who found a penny on the sidewalk. Richard, sit down. If you can speak respectfully, we'll explain. If not, you can leave the same way you came. For a moment, it seemed Richard might storm off. Then, perhaps recognizing the steel in his mother's voice, he lowered himself into one of the porch chairs. Margaret retrieved Ezra's journal, opening it to a particular passage. Your great-grandfather wrote this in 1951. Wealth is a test of character. It reveals who we truly are, not who we pretend to be. I pray my descendants pass this test with grace. She looked directly at Richard. You failed that test before we even found his legacy. You revealed exactly who you are when you thought we had nothing to offer but burden. What legacy? Richard asked, his attorney instincts overriding his indignation. What did he leave? Harold took over the narrative, explaining the discovery, the securities, the careful accumulation of wealth hidden for 7 decades. He watched his son's expression shift from skepticism to amazement to calculation. 50 million? Richard breathed. You're saying there's $50 million in Depression-era securities? Potentially more, Margaret confirmed. All legally structured now in trusts that will benefit the entire family appropriately over time. Appropriately, Richard seized on the word. What does that mean? You need professional management for that kind of wealth. I know people who specialize in ultra-high net worth family offices. We should liquidate the securities immediately. Diversify into modern instruments. Richard, Harold interrupted. Stop. The money is secured. The trusts are established. Professional managers are already in place. Your services are not required. My services? Richard stood abruptly. I'm your son. Not some random advisor you can dismiss. This affects my children's future. Yes, it does, Margaret agreed. Which is why we've ensured they'll receive excellent educations and have opportunities to build their own successes. Just as you did. Just as I. Richard laughed bitterly. Do you have any idea how hard I've worked? How many 16-hour days? How many sacrifices? Do you have any idea how many 16-hour days your father worked in the mill? Margaret countered. How many night shifts I took to pay for your college? We know about hard work, Richard. The difference is, we never let it make us cruel. The accusation hung in the air. Richard opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. I'm not cruel. I'm practical. There's a difference." "Is there?" Harold asked. "When you told us to abandon our home, when you called it worthless, when you tried to shuffle us into a facility like unwanted furniture, was that practical or cruel?" "I thought I was helping," Richard said, but the words lacked conviction. "You're 73 years old. The cabin needs constant maintenance. It made sense to simplify." "To you?" Margaret said. "It made sense to you. You never asked what made sense to us." Richard sank back into the chair, some of his rigid posture softening. For the first time in years, Margaret caught a glimpse of the boy he'd been, before ambition and success had armored him against sentiment. "I don't understand," he said quietly. "This place, it's just a building. Old wood and memories. Why choose it over comfort and security?" Harold and Margaret exchanged glances. Decades of marriage, allowing silent communication. How could they explain to someone who measured worth in square footage and market value? "Do you remember," Margaret began, "when you were 7 and had pneumonia? We brought you here to recover. You spent 3 weeks on that couch, watching the lake, healing in the quiet." Richard's expression flickered. "I remember being bored." "You remember wrong," Harold said gently. "You told us it was the best 3 weeks of your life. You learned to identify birds by their calls, caught your first fish off the dock, helped me rebuild the front steps." "That was a long time ago," Richard muttered. "Yes," Margaret agreed. "Before you learned to be embarrassed by us." They sat in uncomfortable silence, the lake breeze carrying the scent of pine and possibilities. Finally, Richard spoke again, his voice different, smaller, somehow. "What happens now? With the money? With the family?" "Nothing changes," Harold said. "We'll still live here, still be who we are. The trust will provide for everyone appropriately, education, healthcare, opportunities, but no one gets a free ride to leisure. Your great-grandfather believed wealth should enable purpose, not replace it," Margaret added. "We intend to honor that philosophy." Richard absorbed this slowly. "And my role is to be our son," Margaret said simply. "Not our financial advisor, not our estate planner, our son. If you can remember how to do that." "I don't know if I can," Richard admitted, the honesty seeming to surprise him. "I've been focused on success for so long, I might have forgotten what family means beyond asset accumulation." "Then maybe," Harold suggested, "it's time to remember." Richard left an hour later, his departure markedly different from his last visit. No slammed doors or spinning tires, just a thoughtful man driving slowly down a dirt road, perhaps seeing it clearly for the first time in decades. Margaret and Harold sat on the porch long after his car disappeared, processing the emotional upheaval of the morning. "Do you think he heard us?" Margaret asked. "I think he heard something," Harold replied. "Whether he truly listens is up to him." Over the following weeks, their new reality began to settle into manageable patterns. The initial frenzy of verification and legal structuring gave way to more measured planning. They met regularly with Pemberton and their team of advisors, but always returned to the cabin, to the life that had sustained them before fortune literally emerged from beneath their feet. Sarah visited next, flying in from Connecticut with her husband, David. Her reaction to the news was more complex than Richard's joy for their security, mixed with visible recalculation of her own position in the family hierarchy. "I'm happy for you," she said, though her smile seemed strained. "It's amazing that great-grandpa Ezra had such foresight, or such paranoia," David added, his banker's mind clearly spinning through implications. "Though I suppose there's little difference when it comes to wealth preservation." They toured the cabin with new eyes. Sarah, suddenly interested in family history she'd previously dismissed. She asked about photographs, heirlooms, stories from Margaret's childhood that might provide context for Ezra's decisions. "I wish I'd known him," she said, studying a faded photograph of Ezra standing beside the newly built cabin. "He seems like he was quite a character." "He was a careful man who'd seen too much," Margaret replied. "The crash of '29 shaped his entire worldview. He never fully trusted banks or brokers again." "Smart man," David murmured, then caught himself. "I mean, from a historical perspective. Obviously, modern financial instruments are much more secure. Harold barely suppressed a snort. Margaret placed a calming hand on his arm. The visit was cordial but strained. Sarah and David clearly struggling to reconcile their assumptions about Harold and Margaret with the reality of their newfound wealth. They left after 2 days, promising to bring the grandchildren for a longer visit during summer vacation. Michael's arrival the following week provided a different dynamic entirely. The youngest of their children, he'd retained more of the warmth that Richard had shed in pursuit of success. His reaction to the news was pure, uncomplicated joy. "This is incredible," he exclaimed, hugging them both. "Not the money. Well, yes, the money, but the story. Great-grandpa hiding a fortune for 70 years. It's like something from a movie." He peppered them with questions about Ezra, about the discovery, about their plans. Unlike his siblings, he showed no concern about his own financial benefit, simply happiness for his parents' security. "You can finally fix the roof properly," he said, echoing Harold's first practical thought. "And maybe get a new dock that doesn't try to pitch everyone into the lake." They laughed, the sound washing away weeks of tension. This was what family reactions should be: joy for each other's good fortune, not calculations of personal benefit. Michael stayed a week, helping Harold with repairs and listening to Margaret's stories about the grandfather he'd never met. His presence reminded them why they'd worked so hard all those years, not for wealth or recognition, but to raise children capable of genuine emotion and connection. On his last night, as they sat around a bonfire by the lake, Michael raised a question his siblings hadn't considered. "What are you going to do with it all? I mean, $50 million is more than anyone could spend in a lifetime, especially living here." Margaret and Harold exchanged glances. They'd been discussing this very question with their advisors, exploring options that honored both Ezra's legacy and their own values. "We're creating a foundation," Margaret explained. "The Ezra Campbell Foundation for Rural Education. It'll provide scholarships for students from small towns, kids who might not otherwise afford college. And we're endowing repairs for the regional hospital," Harold added. "The emergency room that saved my life when I had my heart scare deserves better equipment than they can afford." Michael's eyes misted. "That's perfect. It's exactly what great-grandpa would have wanted: wealth-serving purpose, not the other way around." They talked late into the night about plans and possibilities: environmental conservation for the lake region, support for local food banks, quiet help for neighbors facing medical bankruptcies, all the ways their windfall could ripple outward without fanfare or recognition. "Richard won't understand," Michael observed. "He'll see it as waste, giving away family money." "Richard sees everything through the lens of acquisition," Harold said. "Maybe someday he'll learn there are other ways to measure worth." As summer progressed, their new life found its rhythm. The cabin underwent careful restoration, not modernization that would strip its character, but thoughtful repairs that preserved its essence while ensuring another 70 years of shelter. The roof was rebuilt with materials that matched the original. The dock was replaced with sustainable local timber. The foundation crack that had worried them for years was professionally repaired. But the most significant changes were invisible. The constant low-grade anxiety about money that had shadowed their retirement vanished. Medical expenses no longer required agonizing choices between prescriptions and groceries. They could help neighbors without depleting their own resources, offer scholarships anonymously to promising local students, support the small-town institutions that had sustained them through lean years. Pemberton visited monthly, reviewing investment performance and discussing charitable giving strategies. He'd become more than a financial advisor. His initial professional interest had evolved into genuine admiration for clients who viewed wealth as responsibility rather than privilege. In 40 years of practice, he told them during one visit, "I've rarely seen new wealth handled with such grace. Most people either hoard it fearfully or spend it recklessly. You've found the middle path." "We had a good teacher," Margaret replied, touching Ezra's journal, which now occupied a place of honor on the mantel. "He showed us what not to do by hiding it all away, but he also showed us the dangers of letting money define you." The journal had become their guidebook, its worn pages offering wisdom across decades. They'd found later entries discussing his regrets about the secrecy, his hope that whoever found the fortune would use it more wisely than he had. I let fear rule me. One passage read, fear of corruption, of loss, of seeing my family destroyed by greed, but in protecting them from wealth's dangers, I may have robbed them of its possibilities. May future generations find better balance. Harold and Margaret were determined to honor that wish. The foundation was established with an initial endowment of $10 million. Its mission focused on education and healthcare in rural communities. They insisted on anonymity for most gifts, wanting impact without acclaim. But the universe has a way of balancing scales. Their quiet generosity, intended to remain secret, gradually became known through the grateful whispers of beneficiaries. The young woman whose scholarship allowed her to become the town's first doctor in a decade. The family whose medical debts were mysteriously forgiven, the community center whose renovation was funded by an anonymous donor everyone somehow knew. Richard visited again in August, his demeanor markedly different from previous encounters. Success had always come easily to him, but witnessing his parents navigate sudden wealth with wisdom he couldn't have mustered humbled him in ways failure never had. I've been thinking, he began over coffee on the porch, about what you said. About measuring worth. Harold and Margaret waited, having learned that Richard processed emotions like legal briefs slowly and with much internal revision. My daughter asked me something last week, he continued. She wanted to know why we never come here anymore, why she hasn't seen you since Christmas. I started to give her my usual answer about busy schedules and distance. But she looked at me with those eyes, you know how kids can see through bullshit, and said, is it because you don't like Grandma and Grandpa's house? Margaret's breath caught, out of the mouths of babes. Indeed, I couldn't lie to her, Richard admitted. So I told her the truth, that I'd forgotten what made this place special because I'd gotten too focused on what it lacked. And? Harold prompted gently, and she asked if we could come for her birthday next month. Here. She wants a party on the dock with fishing and campfires and all the things I've been too sophisticated to appreciate for 20 years. She's welcome anytime, Margaret said. You all are. Richard nodded, then surprised them both by adding, I've been looking at property nearby. Not to develop, he added quickly, seeing their expressions. Just a small place where we could stay during visits. Something simple, like this. The word simple from Richard's mouth was as unexpected as the fortune under their floorboards. Harold and Margaret exchanged glances, hope flickering between them. There's a cottage for sale 2 miles north, Harold offered. The Andersons are moving to be near their grandchildren. It needs work, but the bones are good. Work I could do myself? Richard asked. With my hands, not subcontractors? If you remember how to hold a hammer, Harold said, but his smile softened the words. Maybe you could teach me, Richard replied. Again, the conversation that followed rebuilt bridges both men had thought permanently burned. They discussed renovation plans. Richard asking questions about maintaining old structures with newfound respect for craftsmanship over convenience. Margaret listened from the kitchen, tears sliding silently down her cheeks, not of sorrow, but of gratitude for second chances. Michael called that evening with his own news. Inspired by his parents' foundation, he decided to leave corporate design and start a nonprofit teaching art to underprivileged children. I know it means a pay cut, he said, but seeing you two use wealth for purpose made me realize I'd rather create meaning than logos. Sarah's transformation was subtler, but no less significant. She began volunteering at a Connecticut food bank, her initial discomfort with the clientele gradually replaced by genuine connection. Her Christmas card that year included a photo of her serving Thanksgiving dinner at a homeless shelter, a far cry from the country club galas that had previously defined her charitable involvement. As autumn painted the lake in shades of gold and crimson, the Whitmans hosted their first full family gathering at the cabin in 5 years. Richard's family arrived in a practical SUV rather than his usual luxury sedan. Sarah's children, freed from their usual scheduled activities, rediscovered the joy of unstructured time by the water. Michael brought his new girlfriend, an artist who immediately understood the cabin's appeal. Watching her grandchildren fish off the restored dock, Margaret reflected on the strange journey that had brought them here. Ezra's fortune had indeed transformed their lives, but not in ways anyone could have predicted. The money hadn't changed who they were. It had revealed who they'd always been, while challenging their children to remember values temporarily obscured by ambition. "Penny for your thoughts," Harold said, joining her on the bench they'd installed overlooking the lake. "Just thinking about Grandpa Ezra," she replied, wondering what he'd make of all this. Harold considered. "I think he'd be pleased. His fortune isn't corrupting anyone. It's healing what was broken." That evening, as 3 generations gathered around the dinner table, Richard raised his glass in an unexpected toast. "To the cabin," he said, "for keeping faith with us even when we lost faith with it. And to Grandpa Ezra, who knew that sometimes the greatest treasures need time to ripen before they're ready to be shared." The family drank. The moment's wait acknowledged in silent understanding. Later, as children roasted marshmallows and adults shared stories, Margaret noticed Richard teaching his daughter to identify constellations, knowledge Harold had given him decades ago, now passed to another generation. Sarah approached her mother as the evening wound down. "I owe you an apology," she said quietly, "for all the times I suggested you and Dad should move somewhere more convenient. I didn't understand what this place meant." "You understand now," Margaret replied. "That's what matters." "It's like the money," Sarah continued. "Hidden value that only reveals itself when you look deeper than the surface." Margaret hugged her daughter, feeling the walls that had divided them crumble like old mortar. The fortune had done what money alone never could. It had forced them all to examine their values and choose who they wanted to be. As the gathering concluded and families prepared for departure, Richard lingered. His closing on the Anderson cottage was scheduled for the following week, and he wanted to discuss renovation plans with Harold. "I'm thinking of doing it the way Great-Grandpa would have," he said. "By hand, taking time, building something that'll last." "It's harder that way," Harold warned. "I'm counting on it," Richard replied. "I've spent 20 years taking shortcuts. Maybe it's time to learn the long way around." After everyone left, Harold and Margaret sat in the quiet cabin, surrounded by the echoes of laughter and reconciliation. The metal box that had contained Ezra's fortune now held new treasures: photos from the gathering, drawings from grandchildren, a letter from the scholarship recipient who'd become a doctor. "We should write our own journal," Margaret suggested, "for whoever comes after us, not about hidden money, but about what we learned from finding it." Harold agreed, and they began that night, taking turns recording the story of a fortune that had waited 70 years to transform not just bank accounts but hearts. They wrote about Ezra's fears and wisdom, about Richard's journey from disdain to appreciation, about the ways sudden wealth had challenged and ultimately strengthened family bonds. The first snow fell early that year, blanketing the cabin in pristine white. Harold and Margaret woke to a transformed landscape, the familiar made magical by winter's touch. Over coffee, they reviewed plans for the foundation's next grants, discussed visits from grandchildren during winter break, and marveled at life's unexpected turns. A year had passed since Richard had called the cabin worthless. Now his own cottage stood 2 miles north, its renovation a labor of love that had rekindled his connection to craftsmanship. Sarah visited monthly, her children learning to cross-country ski on the frozen lake. Michael's art program had expanded to 3 cities, funded partly by the foundation but mostly by his own fundraising efforts. Ezra would be proud, Harold said, watching snow fall on the lake he'd loved for 5 decades. "I think he is," Margaret replied. "Somewhere, somehow he knows his patience wasn't wasted." The cabin stood solid against winter wind, its repairs invisible but vital, like the healing of a family that had almost fractured beyond recovery. In the basement, the floor was solid now, no loose boards hiding secrets. But the house still held treasures in photos on the walls, in memories soaked into wood grain, in the promise of generations yet to come who would find refuge within these walls. Margaret opened Ezra's journal to his final entry, written just days before his death. "I leave this fortune not in hope of wealth, but in hope of wisdom. May those who find it remember that the greatest treasures cannot be deposited in banks or hidden beneath floors. They live in the hearts we touch, the values we pass on, the love we choose to share, even when it would be easier to hoard." She closed the journal gently, understanding finally complete. The $50 million had been the least of Ezra's gifts. His true legacy was the lesson learned through its discovery that worth couldn't be measured in market value, that family bonds were more precious than portfolios, and that a cabin dismissed as worthless could shelter treasures beyond price. Outside, snow continued to fall, each flake unique yet part of the larger tapestry blanketing the Minnesota woods. Like family, Margaret thought individual and interconnected, fragile alone but powerful together, creating beauty through patient accumulation. Harold squeezed her hand. No words necessary. After 52 years of marriage, they sat in comfortable silence, wealthy beyond their wildest dreams, yet still themselves. Still here in the cabin that had kept faith when faith was hard to find. The fire crackled in the wood stove. Ezra's journal rested on the mantel, and somewhere beneath the solid floor, the memory of a metal box waited patiently to remind them that the best surprises come to those who dig deeper than surface judgments. In the distance, a car engine announced a visitor. Through the window, they saw Richard's SUV navigating the snow-covered drive, his family bundled inside for an impromptu winter visit. Margaret smiled, rising to put coffee on and warm the cinnamon rolls she'd baked that morning, just in case. "Company's coming," she announced unnecessarily. "Family," Harold corrected, standing to greet their son. "Family's coming home." The door opened to admit cold air, warm laughter, and the next chapter of a story that had begun with betrayal but found its way to redemption. The cabin wrapped around them all, its walls strong enough to hold both history and hope, proof that sometimes the greatest treasures are hiding in plain sight, waiting for hearts wise enough to recognize their worth. As winter deepened around Deer Lake, the Whitman family settled into new rhythms. The cabin that Richard had once dismissed now served as the hub of regular gathering. His cottage renovation had become a family project, with Harold teaching his grandchildren basic carpentry, while Margaret shared stories of their great-great-grandfather Ezra. The foundation's work expanded quietly but steadily. They'd hired a director, a young woman from a neighboring town who'd lost her own chance at college when her father's farm failed. She understood viscerally the mission of providing opportunities to rural youth who might otherwise be overlooked. "We received 17 applications this week," she reported during their monthly meeting. "All deserving, all desperate. How do we choose?" It was a problem Margaret had never imagined, having too many worthy recipients for their available funds. They increased the foundation's endowment by another $5 million, knowing even that wouldn't meet all the need. Pemberton had become more than their financial advisor. He was now a trusted friend who shared their vision of purposeful wealth. During one visit, he brought news that stunned them anew. "Remember those IBM stocks?" he said. "The company just announced a special dividend for long-term shareholders. Your holding qualifies for an additional $2 million. Harold laughed, the sound carrying disbelief even after everything they'd experienced. "It keeps growing, like it has a life of its own. Compound interest is the eighth wonder of the world," Pemberton quoted. "Einstein allegedly said that. Your grandfather understood it intuitively." They directed the unexpected windfall toward establishing a medical clinic in town, addressing the healthcare desert that forced residents to drive 50 miles for basic services. The announcement was met with tears from elderly neighbors who'd been rationing medications due to transportation challenges. But wealth, even purposeful wealth, carried unexpected burdens. Word of their philanthropy spread despite their attempts at anonymity. Distant relatives suddenly remembered their existence. Old acquaintances renewed contact with transparent ulterior motives, and strangers began appearing with hard luck stories and outstretched hands. "I found another letter in the mailbox," Margaret told Harold one morning, holding an envelope addressed in unfamiliar handwriting. "Someone's cousin needs cancer treatment. They heard we help people." They'd already received dozens of similar requests. Each one tore at Margaret's heart real need, mixed with opportunism in proportions impossible to determine from a distance. "We can't help everyone," Harold said gently. "That's what the foundation is for, to create systematic good rather than random charity. But turning away need, even suspicious need, went against every instinct Margaret had developed through decades of stretching dollars and sharing whatever extra they had. Wealth had simplified some aspects of their lives while profoundly complicating others. Richard noticed his parents struggle during a weekend visit. The son who'd once seen only monetary value now recognized the emotional toll of their newfound position. "You need boundaries," he advised over dinner. "Legal ones, emotional ones, practical ones. Let the foundation handle requests. That's why you created it." "Easy to say," Margaret replied. "Harder when someone's standing on your porch with tears in their eyes and a sick grandchild." Richard exchanged glances with his wife Jennifer, who'd undergone her own transformation since the family reconciliation. The woman who'd once focused solely on accumulating status symbols now volunteered at the elementary school and had sold her luxury car for something more practical. "What if," Jennifer suggested, "we help screen requests? Richard has legal training to spot scams, and I've gotten good at reading people through volunteer work. We could be your first filter." The offer represented more than practical assistance. It was an acknowledgement that they were truly family again, united in purpose rather than divided by resentment. Sarah and David visited the following month, bringing news of their own changes. David had left his high-pressure investment banking position for a smaller firm focused on sustainable investing. "Seeing how you've handled the fortune made us rethink everything," Sarah explained. "What good is wealth if earning it destroys your health and family life?" They downsized their Connecticut home, using the difference to establish their own charitable fund focused on arts education. Their children, freed from the relentless pressure of competitive achievement, had blossomed in unexpected ways. "Emma's teaching herself guitar," Sarah reported. "And James spent last weekend building a birdhouse with his grandfather instead of cramming for another standardized test." The mention of standardized tests triggered a discussion about education that revealed how profoundly the family's values had shifted. Where once they'd focused solely on prestigious schools and measurable achievements, now they talked about character development and finding individual purpose. Michael arrived for Thanksgiving with life-changing news of his own. His art program had caught the attention of a national nonprofit, which offered to merge operations and expand his vision to a dozen cities. "It means giving up some control," he admitted. "But think of how many kids we could reach." Harold raised his glass. "To Grandpa Ezra, who'd understand that sometimes letting go is the only way to truly hold on." As winter holidays approached, Margaret found herself reflecting on the year's extraordinary journey. The fortune hidden beneath their floor had revealed itself to be more than money. It was a catalyst for transformation that rippled through generations. She was baking in the kitchen. The same wood stove that Richard had once called a death trap now restored to safe functionality, when Harold appeared with a peculiar expression. "You need to see this," he said, leading her to the living room where he'd been installing new shelving. Behind a loose panel, he discovered another metal box, smaller than the first, but similarly aged. "Not again," Margaret breathed, but this box contained no securities or bonds. Instead, they found photographs, dozens of them, showing Ezra's life before Minnesota, pictures of him in Chicago during the Roaring '20s, images of people they didn't recognize, and most surprisingly, a wedding photo of Ezra with a woman who wasn't Margaret's grandmother. A letter, brittle with age, explained in Ezra's careful script, "My first wife, Catherine, died in the influenza pandemic of 1918. We had no children, but she was the love of my youth. When I remarried and started a new family, I couldn't bear to speak of her. The pain was too fresh, then too distant, then too complicated to explain. But she deserves to be remembered. She was the one who taught me to invest, who believed in careful planning for an uncertain future. Everything I became started with her wisdom." Margaret sank into a chair, overwhelmed by this new dimension of her grandfather's story. The man who'd hidden a fortune had also hidden a grief so profound he'd carried it silently through decades. "He had layers we never imagined," Harold said softly. They spent the evening going through the photographs, piecing together a life story more complex than the simple narrative they'd inherited. Ezra had been young once, in love, devastated by loss, rebuilt through new love, but never forgot his first chapter. "Do we tell the others?" Margaret asked. "I think we must," Harold decided. It's part of the story, part of understanding that people are always more than they appear. When the family gathered for Christmas at the cabin, Margaret shared Ezra's complete story. The revelation that their patriarch had loved and lost before building the life they'd known added depth to their understanding of his choices. He hid money because he'd learned how quickly life could steal what you valued most, Richard observed. It wasn't really about the wealth at all, Sarah added. He was protecting himself from loss as much as protecting the fortune from others. Michael, ever the artist, saw it differently. He was creating a time capsule, not just of money, but of values, stories, lessons. We're still unpacking it. The conversation evolved into broader discussions about family secrets, the stories each generation chooses to tell or hide, and the ways hidden truths eventually surface. They talked late into the night. 3 generations sharing perspectives that would have been impossible before their forced reconciliation on New Year's Eve. As snow fell steadily outside, the Whitmans hosted a gathering that included not just family, but the extended community they'd built through the year. Pemberton came with his wife. The foundation director brought her parents. Neighbors who'd become friends crowded into the expanded living room. At midnight, as they toasted the new year, Harold raised a final glass to the cabin itself, to the home that sheltered secrets and revealed truths, he said, to walls that held firm when family bonds stretched thin, to the place Richard once called worthless that proved worth more than gold, to second chances, Richard added, his voice thick with emotion, to Grandpa Ezra, Sarah continued, who trusted time to heal what he couldn't, to family, Michael concluded. In all its messy, complicated, beautiful reality, Margaret looked around the room at faces that had traveled so far from where they'd started the year. The fortune under the floor had been the least of the treasures they'd uncovered. They'd found their way back to each other, discovered purpose beyond accumulation, and learned that true wealth couldn't be hidden in metal boxes or measured in millions. As guests departed and family settled in for the night, Margaret stood once more at the window overlooking Deer Lake. The moon illuminated snow-covered ice, creating a landscape of silver and shadow that seemed to hold infinite possibility. Harold joined her, as she'd known he would. After 53 years, some patterns were as natural as breathing. Any regrets, he asked, about finding the money? About any of it, Margaret considered. I regret the pain we caused each other, the years of distance, the way success divided us. But without that pain, would we have appreciated the healing? Without the distance, would coming together feel so precious? Ezra's final lesson, Harold murmured. Sometimes things need to be broken before they can be properly mended. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching snow fall on the lake that had witnessed 3 generations of dreams, failures, and redemptions. The cabin around them held stories in every beam and board, Ezra's young love and careful planning, their own struggles and triumphs, their children's journey from indifference to appreciation. Somewhere beneath the solid floor where a fortune had waited 70 years for discovery, the earth held its own patient wisdom. Good things come to those who wait, but better things come to those who dig beneath the surface, who look beyond immediate value to find deeper worth. The cabin would stand for generations more, Margaret knew. Richard's children would bring their children here, would tell stories of the fortune found and the family rebuilt. The foundation would continue its quiet work of opening doors for those who needed just one chance to change their lives. And perhaps, someday, another discovery would emerge from some hidden corner. Not of money that chapter was complete, but of photographs or letters or journals that would add new dimensions to the family story, reminding future generations that people and places always hold more than they initially reveal. We should go to bed, Harold said eventually. Sarah wants to go ice fishing early tomorrow. Since when does Sarah ice fish? Margaret asked, amused. Since she decided to stop scheduling every moment and start experiencing whatever comes, Harold replied. Another transformation we owe to Ezra's patience. As they prepared for bed in the room where Margaret had first broken through the floor, she touched the spot where it all began. The boards were solid now, properly secured, holding no secrets but supporting the weight of daily life. Thank you, she whispered to the grandfather she'd barely known, but who'd shaped her life so profoundly. For the fortune, yes, but mostly for the lesson that true worth is always hidden beneath the surface, waiting for someone with enough faith to keep looking. The wind picked up outside, swirling snow against windows that Harold had reinforced for another 70 years of winters. The cabin creaked gently, a familiar sound that spoke of endurance and shelter and home. In the morning, there would be coffee and laughter and Sarah's unlikely ice fishing adventure. The foundation board would meet next week to review scholarship applications. Richard would continue his cottage renovation with help from his children. Life would move forward, richer in every way that mattered. But tonight, Harold and Margaret Whitman slept peacefully in their cabin by Deer Lake, no longer worried about worthless assessments or hidden treasures. They'd found what they needed, not just financial security, but the knowledge that some things truly are priceless, and the best inheritances can't be deposited in any bank. The cabin kept its watch through the winter night, solid and sure, a testament to the truth that Ezra Campbell had understood and Richard had finally learned. Real value is measured not in market price, but in the love that builds walls, the memories that season wood, and the faith that sees treasure where others see only weathered boards and time-worn floors. And beneath it all, the earth held its secrets, still not of money now, but of roots that run deep, of foundations that endure, of the endless possibility that lies beneath every surface for those brave enough to look beyond the obvious and dig for deeper truth.